The scream that tore through the mountain pass didn't sound human, and Marshal Everett knew in his gut that something terrible had just happened down by the Switchback trail. He'd been checking his trap lines in the high country above Circleville, Utah, on this crisp October morning in 1878 when the sound reached him. The echo bounced off the red rock cliffs, distorting it, but there was no mistaking the grinding crash of wood against stone and the terrified shrieks that followed. Without hesitation, he abandoned his work and sprinted toward the narrow road that wound through the mountains, his powerful legs carrying him swiftly over the rocky terrain. His long dark hair, tied back with a leather cord, whipped behind him as he ran. The buckskin shirt stretched across his broad shoulders and muscular chest as he navigated the steep descent with the ease of a man who'd spent the better part of his 26 years in these mountains. When he reached the edge of the cliff overlooking the Switchback, his heart sank. Below, perhaps 40 feet down a steep embankment, lay the splintered remains of a stagecoach. It had clearly taken the turn too fast, or maybe a wheel had given out. The result was catastrophic. The coach had rolled multiple times, scattering luggage and debris across the hillside. One of the horses was still tangled in the traces, screaming in pain. The other had broken free and was nowhere to be seen. The driver lay motionless on the rocks, clearly beyond help. Marshal didn't hesitate. He found a serviceable path down the slope and half ran, half slid to the wreckage. As he got closer, he heard a soft moan coming from inside the overturned coach. Someone was alive. He reached the shattered vehicle and peered inside. A young woman lay crumpled among the wreckage, her traveling dress torn and dusty, blood streaking down the side of her face. Her eyes were closed, but her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Scattered around her were papers and personal belongings, all covered in dust. "Can you hear me?" Marshal called out, his deep voice gentler than one might expect from a man of his size and rough appearance. Her eyelids fluttered. "Help," she whispered, the word barely audible. Marshal assessed the situation quickly. The coach was unstable, creaking ominously on the slope. He needed to get her out immediately. The door was jammed shut, so he gripped the splintered wood frame and, with a grunt of effort, tore it away with his bare hands. The muscles in his arms bulged as he worked, his strength making short work of what would have taken most men considerable time and tools to accomplish. Carefully, he reached in and checked her for obvious injuries. Her left arm was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. There was a gash on her temple that was bleeding steadily, but when he gently pressed along her spine, she didn't cry out in a way that suggested a back injury. That was good. He could move her. "This is going to hurt," he warned, "but I need to get you out of there before the whole thing slides further down the mountain." She managed a tiny nod, her eyes finally opening to look at him. They were a startling shade of green, even clouded with pain as they were. For a moment, she just stared at him with a confused expression, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Marshal slid his arms beneath her as carefully as he could, one under her shoulders and one under her knees. She gasped in pain as he lifted her, but he worked as quickly and gently as possible. Once he had her clear of the wreckage, he straightened up, cradling her against his chest. She was a slight thing, probably not much over 100 pounds, and carrying her was no burden for a man who regularly hauled deer and elk carcasses down from the high country. "The driver," she managed to gasp. "Is he?" "I'm sorry," Marshal said quietly. "He's gone." Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, whether from pain or grief he couldn't tell. Probably both. She turned her face against his chest, and he felt her body shaking with silent sobs. He needed to get her somewhere safe and warm and fast. The sun was already past its zenith, and temperatures dropped quickly in the mountains once evening came. His cabin was a good 3 miles away, but it was the closest shelter. There was no way he could get her back up to the road with her injuries, and even if he could, there was no guarantee another stage would come through before nightfall. The route through this pass only saw traffic a few times a week. "I'm going to take you to my cabin," he told her. "It's not close, but it's the best option. Can you hold on?" She nodded weakly against his chest. Marshal adjusted his grip on her and began the long walk home. He chose his path carefully, avoiding the steepest sections and the loose scree that could turn an ankle. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness as he walked, sometimes moaning softly, other times lying still and quiet in his arms. He talked to her periodically, trying to keep her aware and alert. "What's your name?" he asked as he navigated around a large boulder. "Amelia," she whispered. "Amelia Jensen. I'm Marshal Everett. You're going to be all right, Amelia, I promise." "Where were you going when the stage crashed?" She was quiet for so long he thought she'd passed out again, but finally she answered. "Circleville. My aunt lives there. She's the school teacher." Marshal knew the woman she meant. Ruth Jensen was well respected in town, one of the few educated women in the small community. She'd come west from Boston 5 years ago and had been teaching the local children ever since. "Miss Ruth is your aunt?" "Yes," Amelia breathed. "She wrote to me. Said she needed help with the school. Too many students for one teacher now." That made sense. Circleville had been growing steadily as more families moved into the area, drawn by the promise of good farmland and the protection of the Mormon settlements that dotted southern Utah. Marshal himself wasn't Mormon, but he'd always gotten along well enough with the folks in town. They bought his furs and the meat he brought in, and they left him alone in his mountain cabin, which was all he really wanted. The sun was low in the sky by the time Marshal's cabin came into view. It was a solid structure he'd built himself 3 years ago, constructed of thick pine logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, evidence of the fire he'd banked before leaving that morning. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by aspen and pine, with a clear stream running nearby. A small barn stood off to one side, where he kept his horse and supplies. He carried Amelia up the 3 steps to the porch and managed to work the door latch without putting her down. Inside, the single room was simple but well maintained. A large bed occupied one corner, covered with thick furs and wool blankets. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cast iron stove beside it for cooking. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room, and shelves lined the walls, holding supplies, tools, and a few precious books. Marshal laid Amelia gently on the bed and quickly built up the fire. Once he had a good blaze going, he lit several oil lamps to provide better light. Then he turned his attention back to his patient. Her face was pale beneath the dirt and blood, and her breathing was still shallow. He needed to clean her wounds and set that broken arm, but first he needed to assess the full extent of her injuries. "Amelia," he said softly, touching her shoulder. "I need to check you over properly. Make sure there are no injuries I missed." She opened her eyes, still clouded with pain. "All right." As gently as possible, he checked her over, trying to be respectful while still being thorough. Besides the broken arm and the head wound, she had bruising all along her left side where she must have been thrown against the coach wall, and her ankle was swollen to nearly twice its normal size. It might be broken or just badly sprained. But her breathing was clear, suggesting her ribs were intact, and she had no signs of internal bleeding that he could detect. He fetched clean cloths and a basin of water from his stores and began cleaning the gash on her temple. She flinched, but didn't cry out. Up close, He could see she was probably around 22 or 23, with delicate features and blonde hair that had been pinned up in a fashionable style, now completely destroyed by the accident. There was a refined quality to her features that spoke of a gentler life than most women out here led. "This needs stitches," he said, examining the wound. "I can do it, but it'll hurt." "Do what you must," she said, her voice stronger now. "I trust you." Those 3 words, spoken with such simple faith, hit him harder than they should have. She didn't know him at all, yet she was placing her life in his hands without question. It stirred something protective in his chest. He had a needle and thread in his medical supplies. Living alone in the mountains meant being able to handle injuries yourself. He'd stitched up knife wounds and animal bites more times than he could count. He heated the needle in the fire to sterilize it, then threaded it with practiced efficiency. "This will be the worst part," he warned. She nodded, her jaw set with determination. As he worked, she gripped the furs beneath her with her good hand, her knuckles white with the effort of staying still. She whimpered a few times but never screamed, never thrashed. He worked as quickly as he could, his large fingers surprisingly deft despite their size. When he tied off the final stitch, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You did real good," he told her. "That took courage." "You have a gentle touch," she said, managing a weak smile. For such a large man, he felt heat rise in his face at the compliment. "I try not to make things worse." Next came the arm. This would be harder. He fetched 2 straight pieces of wood from his supply pile and tore a clean sheet into strips for binding. Then he returned to the bed and sat beside her. "I'm going to have to set the bone," he explained. "It's going to hurt worse than the stitches." She turned even paler, if that was possible. "Will you give me something to bite on?" He found a leather strap and placed it between her teeth. Then, with careful precision, he felt along her forearm, locating the break. It was clean, at least, not a compound fracture. Taking a deep breath, he gripped her arm firmly and pulled, feeling the bone slip back into alignment. Amelia's scream, even muffled by the leather, was heart-wrenching. Tears streamed down her face as he quickly splinted the arm and bound it tight. When he finished, she was breathing hard, her whole body shaking. "It's done," he said softly, removing the strap from her mouth. "The worst is over." She nodded, unable to speak. He fetched a cup of water and helped her drink, supporting her head with one hand. She swallowed gratefully, then lay back against the pillows. "Thank you," she whispered. Marshal cleaned and bandaged the smaller cuts and scrapes, then wrapped her swollen ankle. By the time he finished, full darkness had fallen outside. He made a simple soup from dried meat and vegetables and managed to get Amelia to eat a little. She needed to keep her strength up if she was going to heal. "You can have the bed," he told her. "I'll sleep by the fire." "This is your home," she protested weakly. "I cannot take your bed. You're injured and you need rest. I've slept in worse places than a warm floor." His tone left no room for argument. She was too exhausted to fight him. Her eyes were already drifting closed. He pulled the furs up around her shoulders and checked the fire one more time. Then he spread his bedroll on the floor and lay down, his large frame just fitting in the space between the table and the fireplace. As he listened to Amelia's soft breathing gradually deepen into sleep, Marshal found himself thinking about the strange turn his day had taken. This morning he'd been a solitary mountain man checking his trap lines, and tonight he had a beautiful injured woman sleeping in his bed. Life had a way of surprising you, he supposed. He must have dozed off eventually, because he woke to the sound of Amelia crying out in her sleep. He was on his feet instantly, moving to her side. She was thrashing weakly, caught in a nightmare, calling out words he couldn't quite make out. "Amelia," he said, touching her shoulder gently. "Wake up, you're safe." Her eyes flew open, wild with fear. For a moment she didn't seem to recognize where she was and she shrank back from him. "It's all right," he said in his calmest voice. "You're safe. You're in my cabin, remember." The stagecoach crashed. Recognition slowly dawned in her eyes and she relaxed slightly. "I'm sorry. I was dreaming about the accident, the way the coach rolled and rolled. I couldn't stop it." "That's natural. You've been through something terrible." He fetched fresh water and helped her drink again. "Try to rest. You're safe now." She caught his hand as he turned to go back to his bedroll. Her fingers were small and delicate compared to his rough, calloused ones. "Will you sit with me, just for a while? I don't want to be alone." Marshal pulled one of his chairs close to the bed and sat down, still holding her hand. "I'm right here." She held his gaze for a long moment, something unreadable in her green eyes. "You saved my life today. Anyone would have done the same. But it was you," she said softly. "You were the one who was there." He didn't know what to say to that, so he just squeezed her hand gently. After a while, her eyes drifted closed again, but she didn't let go of his hand. He sat there through the night, watching over her, feeling the warmth of her small hand in his larger one. When dawn light began filtering through the cabin's single window, Amelia was still sleeping, her breathing deep and even. Marshal carefully extracted his hand from hers and stood, stretching his stiff muscles. He built up the fire and put coffee on to boil, then stepped outside to check on the animals and get a sense of the weather. The morning was crisp and clear, perfect autumn weather. He brought in fresh water from the stream and checked his food supplies. He had plenty to last them both for a while, which was good, because Amelia wasn't going to be fit to travel for several days at least, possibly longer. He was cooking breakfast when she woke. She tried to sit up and gasped in pain, her face contorting. "Easy," he said, crossing to her side quickly. "You're going to be sore for a while. Let me help you." He slipped his arm around her shoulders and helped her into a sitting position, propping pillows behind her back. This close, he could smell lavender in her hair beneath the dust and blood. It was a scent completely foreign to his rough cabin, delicate and feminine. "I must look terrible," she said, touching her tangled hair with her good hand. "You look like someone who survived a stagecoach crash," he said honestly, "which means you look strong." A hint of color came to her pale cheeks. "I don't feel very strong. I feel like I've been trampled by a horse." "That's understandable. You broke your arm, sprained or broke your ankle, got a concussion, and you're bruised all over. You're lucky you didn't break your neck." "Thanks to you," she said, meeting his eyes. "If you hadn't found me. But I did find you. That's what matters." He brought her breakfast, helping her eat since she could only use one hand. She seemed embarrassed by the necessity, but he acted as if it was the most natural thing in the world. The truth was, he was finding it surprisingly pleasant to have someone to care for. His life had been solitary for so long that he'd forgotten what it was like to share space with another person. "You said you're a trapper?" Amelia asked as he cleaned up the breakfast dishes, among other things. "I hunt, trap, and sell the furs and meat in town. Sometimes I guide hunting parties or help search for lost travelers. Whatever work comes my way." "How long have you lived out here?" 3 years in this cabin. Before that, I moved around quite a bit. Came west from Missouri when I was 18. "Do you have family back in Missouri?" His expression darkened slightly. "Not anymore. My parents died of cholera when I was 17. I had a younger sister, but she died the same year. After that, there was nothing keeping me there." "I'm so sorry," Amelia said softly, genuine sympathy in her voice. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the topic. "It was a long time ago. What about you? Besides your aunt, do you have family?" "My parents are both alive back in Chicago. They weren't happy about me coming west, but Aunt Ruth needed help and I wanted an adventure." She laughed, though it turned into a wince. I suppose I got more adventure than I bargained for. Chicago's a long way from here. That was part of the appeal. I wanted to see something different, experience something beyond the life that was planned for me. She looked around the cabin with frank curiosity. I suppose you understand that feeling. He did, more than she knew. What kind of life was planned for you? The usual for a woman of my class. Marry some suitable young man my father approved of, have children, host dinner parties, and slowly die of boredom. There was an edge to her voice that surprised him. I know I should be grateful. Many women would envy such a life. But I wanted more. I wanted to matter, to do something meaningful. Teaching seemed like a way to accomplish that. Marshal found himself reassessing her. He'd assumed, based on her refined appearance and obvious education, that she was just another pampered city girl playing at frontier life, until reality got too hard. But there was steel in her voice when she talked about her choices, a determination that reminded him of why he himself had come west. Teaching is important work, he said. Out here especially. These kids need education if they're going to build something better than what their parents had. That's what Aunt Ruth says in her letters. She makes it sound almost like a calling. Your aunt is a good woman. She's helped a lot of families in Circleville. Amelia shifted position and winced. Speaking of my aunt, she'll be expecting me. When the stage doesn't arrive, she'll worry. The stage line will send someone to investigate when the coach doesn't reach the next station. They'll find the wreck and report it. Word will get back to Circleville eventually. But she'll think I'm dead, Amelia said, distress clear in her voice. Marshal considered this. You're in no condition to travel. It would take at least 2 days to get you to Circleville in your current state, and the journey could set back your healing considerably. But I could ride down myself, let your aunt know you're alive and recovering. Would take me about 6 hours on horseback. Would you? Hope lit up her face. I hate the thought of her grieving for me unnecessarily. I'll leave this afternoon once I've made sure you're settled and have everything you need. I can be back by tomorrow morning. Thank you, Marshal, truly. You've been so kind. He felt that same warmth in his chest that he'd felt the night before. You need to rest and heal. That's all the thanks I need. He spent the rest of the morning making sure Amelia was as comfortable as possible. He helped her outside briefly so she could manage her personal needs, supporting her weight as she hobbled on her one good foot. She was mortified by the necessity, but he pretended not to notice her embarrassment. He also heated water and helped her clean up as best she could, though he left her alone for the actual washing, just providing the supplies and assistance getting in and out of the chair. By early afternoon, he had his horse saddled and ready to go. He'd left Amelia with water, food, extra wood for the fire, and strict instructions not to try to move around without support. I'll be back tomorrow morning, he told her as he prepared to leave. Don't overdo it while I'm gone. I'll try to resist the urge to dance, she said dryly, making him laugh. It was a good sound, he realized. He didn't laugh often enough. The ride down to Circleville was uneventful. He pushed his horse harder than he normally would, wanting to deliver his message and get back to Amelia as quickly as possible. He told himself it was just because she was injured and shouldn't be left alone for long, but there was more to it than that. In just one day, he'd grown accustomed to her presence in his cabin. The space felt less empty with her in it. He reached Circleville just as the sun was setting. The town was small, maybe 200 people, clustered around a main street with a general store, a church that doubled as a school, a smithy, and a handful of other businesses. Most people lived on farms surrounding the town itself. Marshal went directly to the small house behind the church where Ruth Jensen lived. She answered his knock with a worried expression that deepened when she saw him. Marshal Everett, she said. "What brings you to town so late?" "I have news about your niece, Miss Ruth. She's alive." The older woman swayed and Marshal reached out to steady her. Alive. But the stage didn't arrive and there were reports of an accident. They said everyone was killed. "The driver didn't make it, but I pulled your niece from the wreck. She's at my cabin, recovering. She's got a broken arm and some other injuries, but she'll heal." Ruth's hand went to her heart. "Thank God, thank God." Tears streamed down her face. "Can I see her? She's not fit to travel yet. Give her a few more days to heal, then I'll bring her down. I just wanted you to know she was safe." Ruth gripped his hands in both of hers. "Bless you, Marshal, you saved her life. Just happened to be in the right place." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," Ruth said firmly. "You were exactly where you needed to be. Now tell me about her injuries. How badly is she hurt?" Marshal explained Amelia's condition in detail. Ruth listened intently, asking practical questions about treatment and care. It was clear she was used to dealing with emergencies out here. "You've done well," she said when he finished. "Better than many trained doctors I've known. She's lucky it was you who found her." He stayed long enough to have a quick meal and pick up a few supplies Ruth insisted he take back for Amelia, including clean clothes and some personal items. Then he began the long ride back through the darkness. The moon was bright enough to see by, and his horse knew the trail well. It was past midnight when he finally arrived back at the cabin. He was exhausted but satisfied. He'd accomplished what he set out to do. When he pushed open the cabin door, he found Amelia awake, her eyes anxious in the lamplight. "You're back," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Did you think I wouldn't be?" He began unsaddling his gear. "I worried. It's dangerous riding in the mountains at night. I know these trails better than I know my own face." He brought over the bundle Ruth had sent. "Your aunt sends her love and these things she thought you might need." Amelia opened the package with her good hand, tears forming in her eyes when she saw the familiar items. "You told her I'm all right." "I did. She wanted to come immediately, but I convinced her to wait until you're stronger. Thank you." She wiped at her eyes. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you for all you've done. Get better. That'll be payment enough." He banked the fire and rolled out his bedding. "Now get some sleep. You should be resting, not waiting up for me. I couldn't sleep until I knew you were safely back." He paused, surprised by the admission. She'd been worried about him. When was the last time anyone had worried about Marshal Everett? "Well, I'm safely back, so sleep now. Good night, Marshal. Good night, Amelia." The next few days fell into a gentle rhythm. Marshal would wake at dawn, build up the fire, and make breakfast. He'd help Amelia with her morning needs, then set about his daily tasks while she rested. He couldn't neglect his work entirely, but he stayed close to the cabin, checking his nearest trap lines and bringing in meat and firewood. Amelia proved to be better company than he'd expected. She was intelligent and well-read, and they had long conversations about books they'd both enjoyed. She'd brought several volumes with her that had survived the crash, and she read to him in the evenings as he worked on repairing equipment or preparing furs. Her voice was pleasant, and he found himself looking forward to those evening hours. She also had a sharp sense of humor that caught him off guard. When he brought in a particularly large buck one afternoon, she commented dryly, "I suppose that's what passes for grocery shopping out here." "More reliable than waiting for the supply wagon," he shot back, and was rewarded with her laughter. As the days passed, Amelia grew stronger. The swelling in her ankle went down, and while she couldn't put full weight on it yet, she could hobble around the cabin with Marshal's help. The bruising on her face faded from angry purple to yellowish green. The stitches on her temple were healing cleanly. Marshal found himself increasingly aware of her presence in ways that had nothing to do with her injuries. the way the firelight caught in her blonde hair, the determined set of her jaw when she was trying to do something difficult with only one hand, the soft sound of her breathing at night, the graceful line of her neck. He tried to tamp down these thoughts. She was a refined city woman, educated and cultured. He was a rough mountain man who'd been living alone for years. They came from completely different worlds. Once she was healed, she'd go to Circleville and take up her teaching position, and he'd go back to his solitary life. That was how it had to be. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two different things. One evening, about a week after the accident, Amelia asked him about the scars on his hands. They were sitting by the fire after dinner, and she'd noticed the network of white lines crossing his knuckles and palms. "Comes with the work," he said simply. "Knives, tools, animal claws. You can't trap and hunt for years without collecting a few marks." "Tell me about this one," she said, touching a particularly prominent scar across his right palm. "Grizzly bear 4 years ago. I was young and stupid, got between a mother and her cubs. She took a swipe at me. I got my hand up just in time to save my face, but she tore up my palm pretty good. Thought I'd lose the use of it for a while, but it healed strong." Amelia traced the scar gently with her fingertip, and Marshal felt his breath catch at the contact. "You could have died. Could have. Didn't." He was very aware of how close they were sitting, how small her hand looked against his. "I learned to be more careful after that." She looked up at him, and the expression in her green eyes made his heart pound. "You're one of the bravest men I've ever met." "I'm just a man who lives in the mountains, Amelia. Nothing special about that. You saved my life. You've cared for me when you didn't have to. You rode through the night to comfort my aunt. You're kind and gentle despite your rough exterior." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "That seems pretty special to me." Marshal knew he should move away, put some distance between them. This was dangerous territory, but he couldn't seem to make himself move. Instead, he reached up and tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear, his rough fingers gentle against her soft skin. "You should rest," he said, his voice rough. "I'm tired of resting." But she didn't pull away from his touch. "I'm tired of being an invalid. I want to feel alive again. You are alive. That's what matters. Thanks to you." The moment stretched between them, charged with something electric. Marshal saw the exact instant Amelia made her decision. She leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft and tentative, questioning rather than demanding. For a heartbeat, Marshal froze, shocked. Then something in him broke loose and he was kissing her back, his hand coming up to cup her face. She made a small sound against his mouth and leaned into him. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Marshal rested his forehead against hers. "Amelia, we shouldn't. Why not?" Her eyes were bright, challenging. "Give me one good reason. You've been through a trauma." "Your judgment might not be clear." "My judgment is perfectly clear. I know exactly what I'm doing." She pulled back to look at him squarely. "Do you want me, Marshal? Because I want you. I've wanted you since I woke up in your arms, feeling safer than I've ever felt in my life. You deserve better than a rough mountain man. Let me decide what I deserve." Her hand came up to touch his bearded jaw. "You're twice the man of any of those suitable young men my father tried to match me with. You're strong and kind and honest. You don't pretend to be something you're not. You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you didn't hesitate to risk yourself to save me. I know you've been nothing but gentle and respectful even though I've been completely at your mercy. I know that when you look at me, I feel like I matter, like I'm more than just a pretty ornament or a potential wife for some businessman." She held his gaze steadily. "I know my own heart, Marshal, and my heart is telling me that you're a good man, maybe the best man I've ever met." Marshal felt something crack open inside his chest. He'd been alone for so long, had convinced himself he preferred it that way. But Amelia's words were like sunlight breaking through clouds, warming places in him that had been cold for years. "I'm not good with words," he said roughly. "I don't know how to talk pretty or say the kinds of things you're probably used to hearing. I don't want pretty words, I want honesty." He took a deep breath. "Then, honestly, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. The way you laugh, the way you push through pain without complaining, the sound of your voice when you read to me. You make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place I sleep. And that scares the hell out of me because I know you're going to leave eventually, and I don't know how I'm going to go back to being alone after having you here." Amelia's eyes were shining with tears, but she was smiling. "What if I don't want to leave? You have to. Your aunt is expecting you. You came here to teach. I can teach and still see you. Circleville isn't that far away. It's a full day's ride in good weather. Then I'll learn to ride better." She caught both his hands in hers, squeezing tight despite the splint on her arm. "I'm not saying I have all the answers, Marshal. I don't know exactly how this works, but I know I don't want to lose you. Can't we at least try?" He looked down at their joined hands, his large and scarred, hers small and smooth. They shouldn't fit together, but somehow they did. Maybe that was enough. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like to try." Her smile was radiant. She leaned in and kissed him again, and this time Marshal didn't hold back. He pulled her carefully into his arms, mindful of her injuries, and kissed her with all the longing and hope and fear he'd been holding inside. She melted against him, her good arm coming around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Amelia laughed softly. "I think that's the most alive I've felt since before the accident." "We should probably slow down," Marshal said, though he made no move to let her go. "You're still healing." "My lips work just fine," she said pertly, making him laugh. They sat together by the fire, Amelia tucked against Marshal's side until the flames burned low. Then Marshal helped her to bed, and for the first time, bent down to kiss her good night before returning to his bedroll by the fire. As he lay there in the darkness, listening to her breathing even out, Marshal felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope for a future that held more than just surviving alone in the mountains. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could have something more. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Marshal was outside splitting wood when he heard a horse approaching. He set down the axe and watched as a rider came up the trail. It was Tom Harrison, one of the men from Circleville who occasionally hired Marshal as a hunting guide. "Morning, Tom," Marshal called out. "What brings you up here?" Tom dismounted, looking uncomfortable. "Got some news from the stage line. They sent investigators to the wreck site, found the driver's body like we expected." I told them about that. "Yeah, but they also found some things in the wreckage, papers and such. Seems the young lady who was on the stage was carrying something valuable. Documents related to a land grant. Some folks are asking questions about what happened to them." Marshal felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What kind of folks?" "The kind that don't like loose ends. The stage company wants to make sure all the passengers' belongings are accounted for. And there's a man who came to town yesterday, says he was supposed to meet Miss Jensen when she arrived. Real insistent about finding her and her property." From inside the cabin, Amelia called out, "Marshal, who's there?" Tom's eyebrows went up. "She's here. The young lady survived. I pulled her from the wreck. She's been recovering here." Marshal kept his voice even. "What kind of man is asking about her? Calls himself Richard Shaw. Dressed fancy, talks smooth. Says he's a lawyer from Chicago handling some business for the Jensen family." Tom looked troubled. "But something about him doesn't sit right with me. The way he asks questions like he's trying to catch you in a lie." Marshal's protective instincts flared. "Thanks for the warning, Tom. I'll handle it. After Tom left, Marshal went back inside. Amelia was sitting up in bed, worry clear on her face. "What was that about? I heard you mention someone from Chicago." He explained what Tom had told him. As he spoke, Amelia's face went pale. "Richard Shaw," she said quietly. "I know that name. He works for my father's business rival, a man named Thornton. They've been trying to acquire some property my father owns, land with mineral rights. When I left Chicago, my father gave me documents to deliver to Aunt Ruth for safekeeping. He didn't trust keeping them in Chicago where Thornton's people might get to them. And Shaw knows you were carrying these documents, he must. Probably has spies in my father's office." She looked frightened. "Marshal, those papers are valuable. If they prove ownership of the mineral rights, my father's company could make a fortune. But if they fall into Thornton's hands, where are the documents now, in my traveling case, unless it was destroyed in the crash?" Marshal thought back to the wreck. He'd seen luggage scattered everywhere but hadn't paid much attention to it. His only concern had been getting Amelia to safety. "I need to go back to the wreck site," he said. "See if I can find your case before anyone else does. It's been over a week. Someone else might have found it already." "Maybe, but if there's a chance, I have to try." He began gathering supplies for the trip. "You'll have to stay here alone for a few hours. I'll be fine. Just be careful." He made sure she had everything she needed, then saddled his horse and headed out. The wreck site was about an hour's hard ride away. When he arrived, he found that scavengers had indeed been through, both human and animal. The coach itself was little more than splintered wood now. The horse's body had been dragged off by predators, and most of the obvious valuables were gone. Marshal dismounted and began searching methodically through the debris scattered across the hillside. It took him nearly 2 hours to cover the area thoroughly. He was about to give up when he spotted something wedged under a large rock about 30 feet below the main crash site. It was a leather traveling case, scratched and dusty but intact. He climbed down carefully and retrieved it. The case was locked, but Amelia would have the key. He secured it to his saddle and was about to mount up when he heard voices approaching from the direction of the road. Marshal led his horse into a thick stand of pines and waited. 2 men came into view, both well-dressed and clearly not locals. One was tall and thin with a pinched face. The other was stocky and walked with the confident swagger of someone used to getting his way through intimidation. "Are you sure this is the right place?" the stocky one asked. "This is where the stage went off the road," the thin man replied. "The documents have to be here somewhere. Looks like this whole area's been picked clean already. Then we need to find out who's been here. Someone in Circleville must know something." The thin man kicked at a piece of broken wood in frustration. "Thornton is not going to be happy if we return empty-handed." Marshal waited until they'd left before emerging from his hiding place. So these were Thornton's men, not just Shaw. The situation was more complicated than he'd thought. He rode back to the cabin as quickly as he could. Amelia was sitting at the table when he came in, and her eyes widened when she saw the traveling case. "You found it." "I did, but we've got a problem." There were 2 men at the crash site, working for someone named Thornton. "They're looking for those documents." Amelia used the key she wore on a chain around her neck to open the case. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth for protection, were several official-looking documents with seals and signatures. She pulled them out carefully. "These are the papers my father needs to prove ownership of the Dakota Territory mining claims. Without them, Thornton can challenge the claim and tie everything up in courts for years. Then we need to get them to your aunt for safekeeping, like your father intended. But if Shaw and these other men are watching Circleville, then we'll have to be smart about it." Marshal thought for a moment. "Your aunt needs to know what's going on. I can ride down tonight after dark. Less chance of being seen. Is that safe? Safer than waiting for Thornton's men to come here. He met her eyes seriously. These men won't hesitate to hurt you if they think you have something they want. I need to get you somewhere safe. Fear flickered across her face, but she lifted her chin. Then we do what we have to do. Marshal spent the afternoon preparing. He cleaned and loaded his rifle and checked his pistol. He helped Amelia practice walking on her injured ankle, which was much better now but still weak. If they needed to move quickly, she had to be able to manage. As the sun set, he saddled his horse and prepared to leave for Circleville. But just as he was about to mount up, he heard multiple horses approaching. "Get inside," he told Amelia urgently. "Don't come out no matter what you hear." She limped quickly into the cabin. Marshal positioned himself on the porch, rifle in hand, as 4 men rode into his clearing. He recognized the 2 from the crash site, plus Richard Shaw from Tom's description, and one other rough-looking character. Shaw dismounted with an oily smile. "Mr. Everett, I presume? I'm Richard Shaw. I believe you're sheltering a young lady I've been looking for. What business is that of yours?" Marshal kept his rifle ready but not quite pointing at them. "Miss Jensen was carrying some property that belongs to her father's business partner. I'm here to collect it and escort the young lady safely to Circleville. Funny, because she says those documents belong to her father and you work for his rival." Shaw's smile didn't waver. "There seems to be some confusion. Perhaps if I could speak with Miss Jensen directly. She's recovering from serious injuries and isn't receiving visitors." The stocky man stepped forward threateningly. "Now see here." Marshal shifted his rifle to point directly at the man's chest. "I'd think carefully about your next move." Shaw held up a hand to his companion. "Let's not be hasty. Mr. Everett, you seem like a reasonable man. What would it take for you to see things our way? There's no amount of money that would make me betray a woman under my protection." "Protection?" Shaw's eyes gleamed. "How noble. Though I wonder what Miss Jensen's father would think about his daughter living in sin with a mountain man. That could cause quite the scandal, couldn't it?" Marshal's jaw tightened. "Nothing improper has happened here. I rescued her from a stagecoach accident and provided medical care. Anyone who says different is a liar." "The truth is whatever people believe," Shaw said smoothly. "And people tend to believe the worst, especially about young women in compromising situations. Now, I could spread all sorts of damaging rumors, or you could simply turn over the documents and let us escort Miss Jensen to town. Your choice." Before Marshal could respond, the cabin door opened and Amelia stepped out, leaning on the doorframe for support. "Mr. Shaw," she said coldly. "I might have known Thornton would send you. The answer is no. The documents are my father's property, and they will go where he intended them to go. Miss Jensen, you don't understand the situation. I understand perfectly. Thornton wants to steal what doesn't belong to him, and you're here to do his dirty work." Despite her injuries and the fact she was facing 4 dangerous men, Amelia's voice was steady and strong. "Marshal is right. Those documents belong to my father, and I won't hand them over to thieves." Shaw's pleasant mask slipped, revealing cold anger beneath. "You're making a mistake." "The only mistake I made was underestimating how low Thornton would stoop." She looked at Marshal. "These men need to leave our property. Our property." The words sent warmth through Marshal's chest despite the danger of the situation. "You heard the lady," Marshal said, his rifle still trained on Shaw's men. "Time to go." For a long moment nobody moved. Then Shaw smiled again, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Very well, we'll leave." "But this isn't over, Miss Jensen. Not by a long shot." The men mounted up and rode out. Marshal kept his rifle ready until they were well out of sight, then finally lowered it with a sigh. "You shouldn't have come out," he told Amelia. That was dangerous. They were threatening you because of me. I couldn't just hide inside. She limped over to him, and he caught her automatically when she stumbled. Besides, I wanted them to know I made this choice willingly. You're not forcing me to do anything. They'll be back. And next time they might not bother with talk. Then what do we do? Marshal thought quickly. We get you and those documents to Circleville tonight. Ruth can help you send them on to your father, and you'll be safe in town with witnesses around. Shaw won't dare try anything in front of the whole community. What about you? I can take care of myself. Marshal, no arguments, Amelia. Your safety comes first. He was already moving, saddling a second horse and gathering supplies. Can you ride? I'll manage. He helped her onto the gentler of his 2 horses, then secured her traveling case and other belongings. They set out as full darkness fell, taking a route that avoided the main trail. Marshal knew these mountains intimately, and he used that knowledge to keep them hidden. The ride was hard on Amelia. Marshal could see her gritting her teeth against the pain, but she never complained. They stopped periodically to rest, and Marshal checked her arm to make sure the jolting hadn't damaged it further. It was well past midnight when they finally approached Circleville from the back way, coming in through farmland instead of the main road. Marshal went first to Ruth Jensen's house and knocked softly. Ruth appeared at the door in her nightgown, a lamp in her hand. Her eyes widened when she saw them. Amelia, Marshal, what's happened? They quickly explained the situation. Ruth's expression grew grimmer with each detail. This is serious, she said. Those documents need to be sent to your father immediately, Amelia under armed guard. There's a man in town who runs freight to Salt Lake City, Marshal said. He's trustworthy and he has guards. If we can get the documents to him first thing in the morning, he left yesterday for his regular run, Ruth said. Won't be back for 4 days. Then we send someone to intercept him, Amelia said, or we find another way. What we need is time, Ruth said thoughtfully. Time to get those papers safely away before Shaw and his men can interfere. She looked at Marshal. How much do you trust the people in this town? Some more than others. Why? Because I have an idea. Ruth's plan was simple but clever. The next morning they would let it be known that Amelia had arrived in town, but that she'd been robbed during the Stagecoach crash. Her traveling case and all her valuable belongings were gone. Meanwhile, the real documents would be hidden in the last place anyone would think to look, the schoolhouse, tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible. Shaw will investigate, of course, Ruth said. But he'll find a traumatized young woman recovering from terrible injuries with nothing of value to steal. Eventually, he'll have to give up and leave. And if he doesn't believe it, Amelia asked, then we'll deal with that when it comes, but it gives us time to get the documents safely away. They spent the rest of the night refining the plan. In the morning, Marshal would return to his cabin, making it look like he'd gone about his normal business. Amelia would stay with Ruth and begin recovering publicly, letting the town see her injuries and hear her story of the crash. As dawn approached, Marshal knew he had to leave. He stood with Amelia on Ruth's back porch, reluctant to go. I don't like leaving you here, he said. I'll be safe with Aunt Ruth, and you can't stay in town without people asking questions. Promise me you'll be careful. I promise. She reached up and touched his face. When this is over, we'll figure out what comes next, together. He pulled her into his arms, careful of her injuries, and held her close. I'm going to miss you. It's only for a few days. We can survive a few days. But when he kissed her goodbye and rode out of town as the sun was rising, Marshal felt like he was leaving part of himself behind. In just 10 days, Amelia had become essential to him in ways he couldn't fully explain. The next 3 days were tense. Marshal went about his normal routines, checking trap lines and hunting, but he kept a sharp eye out for Shaw's men. He saw signs that someone had been watching his cabin, hoofprints that weren't his own and broken branches at vantage points overlooking his clearing. But no one approached him directly. On the fourth day, Tom Harrison rode up to Marshal's cabin. "Thought you should know," Tom said. "Shaw and his men left town this morning. Word is they decided Miss Jensen was telling the truth about being robbed and there was nothing here worth staying for. They're really gone. Saw them heading north myself. Course, that doesn't mean they won't come back. But it did mean Amelia was safe for now." Marshal thanked Tom and immediately headed for Circleville. He found Amelia at the schoolhouse with Ruth, helping prepare lessons even with her arm still in a splint. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she met him at the door. Without thinking about propriety or who might be watching, Marshal pulled her into his arms and kissed her soundly. "I take it you heard Shaw left," she said when they came up for air, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright. "I had to make sure you were all right." "I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. The documents went out on the freight wagon yesterday, hidden in a shipment of grain. They should reach my father in a few weeks. Then it's over. This part is." She took his hand. "But Marshal, we need to talk about what happens now." They walked to a quiet spot behind the church where they could speak privately. Amelia turned to face him, suddenly serious. "I'm supposed to stay here and teach. That was the plan and it's still important to me, but I don't want to lose you." "Circleville is a full day's ride from my cabin," Marshal said. "I can't just give up my livelihood and move to town. I'm not suited for that kind of life." "I know. And I wouldn't ask you to change who you are." She squeezed his hand. "But maybe we can find a compromise. You come to town when you can, when you're bringing in furs or meat or just to visit. I'll come to your cabin when school is out for breaks. We make time for each other." "That's not going to be easy." "Nothing worthwhile is easy." She looked up at him with those clear green eyes. "Marshal, in the short time I've known you, you've shown me what it means to be truly cared for, not as an ornament or a prize, but as a person. I don't want to go back to a life where I don't have that." Marshal felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I'm not good at pretty speeches, Amelia. But I know that before I found you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You made me feel alive again. Made me want something more than just surviving another winter." "Then we'll make this work," she said firmly. Somehow, and they did. Over the following months they established a rhythm. Marshal came to Circleville every few weeks, timing his visits to coincide with when he had furs or meat to sell. He'd spend a few days in town, and he and Amelia would steal whatever time together they could. When school broke for the summer, Amelia spent weeks at a time at Marshal's cabin, learning about his world, helping with his work, and falling more deeply in love with both the man and the mountains. The town gossips had plenty to say about the unusual courtship, but Ruth shut down the worst of it with a sharp tongue and steely determination. And as time passed, and people saw how Marshal and Amelia looked at each other, most of the disapproval faded into acceptance. In late spring of 1879, nearly 7 months after the Stagecoach crash, Marshal rode into Circleville with a purpose beyond selling furs. He found Amelia at the schoolhouse, dismissing her students for the day. He waited outside, his heart pounding harder than it had when facing down grizzly bears. When the last student left, Amelia saw him and smiled that radiant smile that always made his breath catch. "Marshal, I wasn't expecting you until next week. I needed to talk to you about something." He twisted his hat in his hands, uncharacteristically nervous. "Walk with me." They headed toward the creek that ran along the edge of town, Amelia chatting about her students' progress while Marshal tried to gather his courage. Finally, they reached a quiet spot under a large cottonwood tree and he stopped. "Amelia, I've been thinking about our situation." "All right," she said, a hint of worry in her voice. "This arrangement we have, seeing each other when we can, it's been good, better than I had any right to hope for." He took a deep breath. "But it's not enough anymore, I want more." "More?" He dropped to one knee, still holding his hat. "I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to know you're safe under my roof at night. I want the right to call you my wife and spend the rest of my life making you happy." He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a simple gold band with a small blue stone set in it. "It's not fancy, but it's the best I could afford. Amelia Jensen, will you marry me?" Amelia's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, of course yes." Marshal stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her with all the love and hope and joy bursting in his chest. When they finally broke apart, both laughing and crying at the same time, Amelia held up her hand to admire the ring. "It's beautiful." "But Marshal, how will this work? I still have my teaching contract and you still have your cabin and trap lines." "I've been thinking about that too. What if I built a bigger cabin closer to town, maybe halfway between here and my current place? Close enough that you could ride to school and back in reasonable time, far enough that I'd still have access to my hunting grounds. And during the winter when the weather's too rough for daily travel, you could stay with your aunt during the week and come home on weekends." "Home," Amelia repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." They were married 6 weeks later in Circleville's small church. Ruth cried happy tears throughout the ceremony. Tom Harrison and several other men from town stood up as witnesses. Amelia wore a simple white dress she and Ruth had made together, and she'd never looked more beautiful to Marshall's eyes. The wedding night was spent at Ruth's house, as Marshall's cabin was too far to reach before dark. But the next morning, Marshall lifted his bride onto her horse and they rode together to the property he'd chosen for their new home. It had a beautiful view of the valley, a clear stream, and enough flat land to build a good-sized cabin. "What do you think?" he asked, suddenly nervous about her reaction. Amelia turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. Then she smiled at him with such love and happiness that Marshall felt his heart might burst. "I think it's perfect," she said. "I think it's the beginning of everything." And it was. Over the summer months, with help from some of the men in Circleville, Marshall built their cabin. It was larger than his old one, with a proper bedroom separated from the main living space, a good kitchen area, and even a small room that could serve as a study where Amelia could prepare her lessons. Amelia threw herself into making the cabin a home. She brought curtains and dishes from her aunt, books for the shelves, and small touches that made the rough space feel warm and welcoming. She also proved surprisingly adept at frontier life, learning to cook on the wood stove, help with the simpler aspects of Marshall's work, and manage the household with confidence. Their first year of marriage had its challenges. The winter was particularly harsh, and there were weeks when Amelia had to stay in town because the snow was too deep for safe travel. Marshall hated those separations, but he used the time to work on improving their home and property. Spring came, and with it, wonderful news. Amelia was pregnant. Marshall was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. The thought of something happening to Amelia during childbirth haunted him, but she seemed completely confident. "Women have babies all the time, Marshall," she said, laughing at his worried expression. "Even out here in the frontier, I'll be fine." Ruth arranged for a midwife from a neighboring town to stay with them as Amelia's time drew near. Their daughter was born on a crisp October morning in 1880, almost exactly 2 years after the stagecoach crash that had brought her parents together. They named her Sarah, after Marshall's mother. Holding his tiny daughter in his large, scarred hands, Marshal felt an overwhelming sense of awe. This perfect little person was part of him and part of Amelia, a living symbol of their love. "She's beautiful," he whispered, afraid to speak too loudly and disturb her. "She has your eyes," Amelia said from the bed, tired but radiant. "And your nose, thank God." Amelia laughed softly. "Between the two of us, she'll be well protected and well loved. That's what matters." And Sarah was both of those things. She grew into a bright, curious child who was as comfortable in the mountains with her father as she was in the schoolhouse with her mother. Marshal taught her to track animals and identify plants, while Amelia taught her to read and write. 3 years after Sarah came a son, Michael, with Marshal's dark hair and Amelia's green eyes. He was followed 2 years later by another daughter, Emma, who had Amelia's blonde hair and a fierce, independent streak that reminded Marshal of her mother stepping out onto the porch to face down Shaw's men. The cabin grew and changed to accommodate their growing family. Marshal added another bedroom, expanded the kitchen, and built a proper barn. Amelia created a garden that produced vegetables all summer long. Their life wasn't easy, but it was rich with love and purpose. Amelia continued teaching for several years, scaling back as their children came but never completely giving it up. She was too good at it, too passionate about education, to walk away entirely. Eventually, she transitioned to teaching from their home a few days a week, tutoring students who needed extra help or who lived too far from town to attend the regular school. Marshal's work evolved too. As the area became more settled, he spent less time trapping and more time guiding hunting parties and leading exploration expeditions into the high country. He became known throughout the territory as an honest, capable guide who could keep even the most inexperienced city hunters safe in the wilderness. On their 5th anniversary, they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and red. Their 3 children were asleep inside, and the evening was peaceful and perfect. "Do you ever regret it?" Marshal asked, pulling Amelia close against his side. "Giving up the life you could have had in Chicago?" "Never," Amelia said firmly. "That wasn't really a life, not for me. It was just existing inside someone else's expectations." She looked up at him. "This is real. You, our children, this place. This is where I belong." "I thank God every day that I was checking my trap lines on that particular morning," Marshal said, "that I was in the right place to hear the crash." "I used to wonder if it was fate," Amelia mused. "The stagecoach rolling at that exact switchback, you being close enough to find me. It seemed like too much coincidence. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was just luck. Either way, I'm grateful. So am I." She turned in his arms to face him fully. "You saved my life that day, Marshal. But what I didn't know then was that you'd also give me a life worth living. You've made me happier than I ever imagined possible." Marshal kissed her softly, still marveling after 5 years of marriage that this incredible woman had chosen him. "You did the same for me. I was just surviving before you came along. You taught me how to really live." They sat together in the gathering darkness, content in each other's presence. Inside, one of the children cried out briefly in sleep, and Amelia stirred, but the cry subsided without them needing to intervene. "They're growing so fast," Amelia said. "Sarah will be starting real school in Circleville next year. I know. I'm not ready for her to be that grown up." None of us are ever ready for our children to grow. But that's part of the joy, isn't it? Watching them become their own people. The years continued to roll by, each bringing its own challenges and triumphs. There were hard winters when supplies ran low and Marshal had to hunt in dangerous conditions to keep his family fed. There were illnesses that had Amelia sitting up all night nursing sick children, and injuries that had Marshal frantically riding for the doctor. But there were also birthdays and holidays, first steps and first words, the joy of watching their children discover the world. Sarah grew into a young woman who combined her mother's love of learning with her father's practical skills. She could track a deer through the forest and recite Shakespeare with equal facility. Michael was quieter, more contemplative, with a talent for working with his hands that Marshal encouraged by teaching him woodworking and metalsmithing. Emma was the wild child, always climbing trees or exploring, making her parents' hearts stop with her fearlessness. When Sarah was 15, she asked about the stagecoach crash that had brought her parents together. "I've heard pieces of the story," she said one evening as the family sat around the dinner table. "But I want to hear the whole thing. How exactly did you meet?" Marshal and Amelia exchanged a glance, and Amelia nodded for him to tell it. So Marshal recounted the story, from hearing the crash to finding Amelia in the wreckage to carrying her to his cabin. The children listened with rapt attention as the tale unfolded, including the dangerous confrontation with Shaw's men and the clever plan to protect the documents. "So you were a hero right from the start," Sarah said to her father with an admiring smile. "I just did what needed doing," Marshal protested, uncomfortable with the praise. "He was absolutely a hero," Amelia said firmly. "He risked himself to save a complete stranger, then cared for her with such gentleness and respect. I fell in love with him almost immediately, though I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude." "And you?" Emma asked her father. "When did you fall in love with Mother?" Marshal thought back to those early days, to Amelia's courage and determination, the way she'd made his cabin feel like a home, the sound of her laughter and the warmth of her hand in his. "I think it was when she stepped out onto the porch to face down Shaw and his men," he said slowly. "She was injured and frightened, but she stood up for what was right anyway. That's when I knew she was the strongest person I'd ever met, and that I wanted to spend my life beside her." "How romantic," Sarah sighed. "It was practical," Marshal corrected, but he was smiling. "Your mother needed help and I was able to provide it. Everything else just followed naturally." "He's being modest," Amelia said. "The truth is, he saw me as a person when so many men would have seen only a burden or an opportunity. He treated me with respect and kindness, and he never asked for anything in return. That's real romance, children. Not grand gestures or pretty words, but consistent, daily choosing to put someone else's well-being alongside your own." As the children grew into adulthood, they each found their own paths. Sarah married a young teacher who'd come to Circleville and moved with him to Salt Lake City, where they opened a school together. Michael took over more and more of Marshal's guiding work, eventually becoming one of the most respected wilderness guides in the territory. Emma, true to her independent nature, became one of the first women in the area to homestead her own claim, building a ranch in the high country with the help of her future husband, a cowboy she met at a Circleville dance. Through it all, Marshal and Amelia remained each other's anchor. As they grew older, their hair turning gray and their bodies moving a bit slower, their love only deepened. They'd weathered storms together, both literal and figurative. They'd built a life from nothing but determination and love. On their 25th anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at the cabin for a celebration. There were toasts and stories, laughter and tears. As the party wound down and the younger folks headed home or to bed, Marshal and Amelia found themselves once again sitting on their porch watching the sunset. 25 years, Amelia marveled. It seems impossible that so much time has passed. Best 25 years of my life, Marshal said. Mine too. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Do you remember what you said to me that first night in your cabin, when I asked you to sit with me because I didn't want to be alone? I said I'd be right there. And you have been. Every day since, you've been right there. That's the greatest gift you could have given me, Marshal, your steady, constant presence. You gave me the same thing. Before you, I was alone in these mountains. I had a life, but I didn't have anyone to share it with. You changed everything. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. From inside, they could hear the muffled sounds of their grandchildren being put to bed, the same sounds they'd heard years ago with their own children. "We've built something good here," Amelia said. "Something that will outlast us." "We have," Marshal agreed. "Our children, our grandchildren, they'll carry forward what we started. I'm so proud of them, of all of them. They have your strength and intelligence, that's why they're doing so well, and your integrity and work ethic." Amelia lifted her head to look at him. "We made a good team, the best team." Marshal pulled her closer. "And we're not done yet. We've got plenty of good years left," and they did. They watched their grandchildren grow, celebrated births and weddings, weathered losses and disappointments together. Through it all, they maintained the routines that had sustained them for decades. Morning coffee on the porch, evening walks by the stream, long conversations about everything and nothing. The small, daily acts of love that had always been the foundation of their marriage. When Marshal was 62, he was caught in an unexpected early blizzard while checking trap lines. He made it back to the cabin, but he was badly frostbitten and developed pneumonia. For 2 terrifying weeks, Amelia nursed him, terrified she was going to lose him, but Marshal was tough, and he had too much to live for. He fought his way back to health, though the illness left him weaker than before. He could no longer spend long days in the mountains, and he had to give up the more strenuous aspects of his work. "I'm getting old," he said ruefully one morning, frustrated by his limitations. "We're both getting old," Amelia said practically. "That's what happens when you're lucky enough to live a long life. And you're still strong, Marshal. You're still the man who pulled me from that wreck and carried me home. That was a long time ago, not so long." She came and wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. "You're still my mountain man, still my hero. A few more gray hairs and some creaky joints don't change that." He turned in her embrace and kissed her forehead. "How did I get so lucky?" "We were both lucky. We found each other when we needed each other most, and we built something beautiful together." At 70, they were still in their cabin, still watching the seasons change in the mountains they both loved. Their children visited regularly, and their grandchildren were starting to have children of their own. The cabin that had started as a simple shelter for 2 people had witnessed the beginning of a large, loving family. One summer evening, as they sat in their usual spot on the porch, Amelia brought up something they'd been avoiding discussing. "We should think about what happens when we're gone," she said gently. "The cabin, the property, we need to make sure it's clear what our wishes are." Marshal didn't want to think about a time when he and Amelia wouldn't be here, but he knew she was right. "I thought maybe we could leave it to Michael. He loves these mountains as much as I do. That seems fitting, and he'll take care of it, keep it in the family." Amelia paused. "Marshal, when the time comes, I want to be buried here, on this property, not in some town cemetery. I want the same thing. This is our home, where we belong." They made arrangements, talking to their children about their wishes. The conversations were difficult but necessary. And having everything settled brought a sense of peace. The years continued their steady march. They slowed down, but they didn't stop living. They still took walks, though shorter ones. They still sat on the porch every evening, weather permitted. They still loved each other with the same depth and constancy that had marked their entire marriage. On a crisp October morning, exactly 45 years after the Stagecoach crash, Amelia woke feeling unwell. She tried to brush it off, but Marshal insisted on riding for the doctor. By the time he returned with medical help, Amelia was much worse. Her heart, the doctor said, was giving out. "How long?" Marshal asked, his own heart breaking. "Could be hours, could be days." "I'm sorry, Marshal. She's lived a good long life, but age catches up with all of us eventually." Marshal sent for their children, and they came quickly. For 2 days, the family gathered around Amelia's bed, taking turns sitting with her, sharing stories and memories. She was conscious on and off, smiling at her children and grandchildren, squeezing hands when she had the strength. But it was clear she was waiting for something. Finally, late on the second night, she asked everyone else to leave. "I need to talk to Marshal alone," she whispered. When they were finally by themselves, Amelia reached for Marshal's hand. He took it gently, mindful of how fragile she'd become. "You need to promise me something," she said, her voice weak but determined. "Anything. Promise me you won't follow right behind me. Promise me you'll stay and watch over our family for a while longer." "Amelia, promise me, Marshal. I need to know you'll be all right." Tears streamed down his weathered face. "I don't know how to be without you. You do. You're the strongest man I know," she managed to smile, "and it's not forever. Eventually you'll join me, but our children and grandchildren still need you. Promise me." "I promise," he said, his voice breaking. "But Amelia, I need you to know something. You've been the best part of my life. Every single day with you has been a gift. I love you more now than I did on our wedding day, and I loved you pretty completely even then. I know. I've always known." She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. "And I love you just as much. You gave me a life of purpose and meaning. You made me feel cherished every single day. I couldn't have asked for a better partner, a better friend, a better love." They sat together through the night, holding hands, sometimes talking, often just being together in comfortable silence. As dawn broke, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Amelia took a deep, shuddering breath and smiled. "Beautiful," she whispered. "One more sunrise with you." "The first of many in whatever comes next," Marshal said. She looked at him one last time with those green eyes that had captured his heart 45 years ago. "I'll wait for you," she promised. "However long it takes, I'll wait." "I'll find you," he promised back. "Just like I found you that day at the Switchback. I'll always find you." As the sun fully cleared the mountains, flooding their bedroom with golden light, Amelia closed her eyes and quietly slipped away. Marshal held her hand for a long time after, tears running down his face, saying goodbye to the love of his life. The funeral was well attended. Amelia had touched many lives in her years in Circleville, both through her teaching and her kindness. They buried her on a small rise near the cabin, overlooking the valley with a simple stone that read, "Amelia Everett. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, teacher, friend. Her love lives on." Marshal kept his promise. He stayed on in the cabin, helped by his children, watching over the family Amelia had left behind. He told stories about their life together to his great-grandchildren, making sure they knew the love story that had started their family. He tended Amelia's garden and kept the cabin exactly as she'd liked it, but he missed her with an ache that never fully subsided. Every evening, he sat on the porch and imagined her there beside him. Every morning, he woke reaching for her. The cabin felt empty despite the frequent visits from family. 2 years after Amelia's death, on another crisp October morning, Marshal woke feeling at peace for the first time since losing her. He got up, made his coffee, and went to sit on the porch as the sun rose. The mountains were beautiful, painted in their autumn colors. Michael found him there an hour later, sitting peacefully in his chair, a slight smile on his face. He'd passed quietly, painlessly, looking out at the view he and Amelia had shared for so many years. They buried Marshal next to Amelia on the rise with a matching stone, Marshal Everett, devoted husband, father, grandfather, mountain man, protector. His strength remains. The cabin stayed in the family, passed down through the generations, always treasured as the place where Marshal and Amelia had built their life together. Their story became family legend, told and retold, the tale of the stagecoach crash at the Switchback, the mountain man who pulled a young woman from the wreck and carried her home, and the love that had grown from that unlikely beginning. Years later, one of their great-great-grandchildren, researching the family history, found Amelia's journal from those early days. In it, she'd written about the first time she saw Marshal, when she woke in the wreckage of the stagecoach to find him pulling her free. "I thought he was a vision at first," she'd written. "This huge, powerful man with gentle hands and kind eyes. He could have left me there. He could have simply reported the crash and let others deal with it. But instead, he risked himself to save me, and then he cared for me with such tenderness that I knew, even in those first confused moments, that my life had just changed forever. I didn't know then that I'd marry him, that we'd build a family and a life together. But somehow, I knew he was important. That he would be important, and I was right." Later entries chronicled their courtship, their marriage, the births of their children, the joys and struggles of building a life together. The final entry, written just days before her death, reads simply, "45 years ago, a stagecoach rolled at a switchback and my real life began. I regret nothing. I would choose this path, this man, this life, 1,000 times over. To anyone reading this in the future, love fully. Choose courageously. Build something that matters. That's what Marshal and I did, and it's made all the difference." The journal was carefully preserved and became a treasured family heirloom, passed down alongside the story of the mountain man and the woman he saved, who saved him right back by giving him someone to love and a life filled with purpose and joy. Their love story became the foundation upon which generations built their own lives, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected moments lead to the most extraordinary journeys, and that true love, once found, can weather any storm and last beyond a lifetime.